All right, here we are coming towards the end of day one, and here to take us home is Alex van Tuyll to talk about energy considerations around CO2 enrichment. So, Alex, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Today, I'd like to share with you some of our latest findings about CO2 and what it means for energy. So, as I'm sure most of us know, right now in controlled environment agriculture, CO2 is fossil. And if you look at a Dutch greenhouse, that mostly comes from natural gas, which is burned on site, and that produces heat, but it also produces electricity and CO2, the topic of this presentation, as a byproduct. Another source is industry. So think about Shell, for example, which sends CO2 to the greenhouse industry directly. So these are all sources that are being used at the moment. And that means that we can achieve high concentrations indoors, and that leads to a higher yield than without CO2. So about 20% more than if you did not have CO2 in the greenhouse. But of course, this is not sustainable. This carbon is fossil. It's been stored under the ground for thousands of years, if not longer. And 90% of the CO2 that is introduced into the greenhouse goes straight out of the window. And what about the remaining 10%? Well, that might end up in the crop, but even then, it doesn't stay there forever. And so really, CO2 enrichment is just CO2 emission via the scenic route of a greenhouse, if you will. So that means that, this isn't sustainable. And of course, the sector is moving towards alternatives. But right now we have fossil heat and fossil CO2, which leads to a high yield per square meter. In the future, greenhouses are expected to be electric, which is more sustainable if your energy grid is sustainable, but it does mean you don't have CO2. Now, what about the other source, industry? Well, that is expected to send its CO2 to carbon capture and storage. And that means that for greenhouse horticulture, there'll be less CO2, and all else being equal, that will lead to a lower yield. So renewable heat, renewable energy, but no CO2, and therefore a lower yield per square meter. What does that mean for the sector? Well, if we have a lower yield per square meter, that means that to produce the same amount of tomatoes, we're going to need, in theory, a bigger greenhouse area. And even if we don't, that means that to produce the same amount of tomatoes, we're putting in more energy, more heat, which means that per kilogram tomato, we are using more energy, all else being equal. So that brings us to non-fossil CO2. Can we still introduce CO2 into greenhouses, keep that yield high without increasing energy intensity? And there are a few options for non-fossil CO2. The first one is an option that any grower can use today, and that is to just open the windows and let some CO2 in from outdoors. You know, it's quite common in a greenhouse that you get concentrations below the outdoor levels. So if you open the window, you can bring some fresh air in and do it that way. Now, that might be fine if it's May, but if it's November, that's going to cost you a lot of energy. That's going to cost you a lot of energy that needs to be heated to heat that incoming air. So that's one option. The second option is biogenic CO2. So that can be from biodigesters or from composting. In this case, I'll just use the image of a mushroom for mushroom composting, but there are lots of different things you could use. And that also costs energy in its own way through, having to pump the CO2 or purify it. And the third source of CO2 that's non-fossil is direct air capture, which is something we've been hearing a lot about. We've also been doing some trials with direct air capture machines, and it basically takes CO2 out of the air, concentrates it, and then brings it into the greenhouse. But of course, these machines also require energy. So that leads us to a question of which future is better. Are we going to have to accept lower yields per square meter, but build bigger greenhouses and ultimately spend more energy for the same yield? Or can we still keep high concentrations of CO2, but with other sources that require energy? Which one uses less energy per kilogram of produce? And that brings us to understanding where the energy demand of CO2 even comes from. How does CO2 demand energy? And there are two aspects. The first one is related to air displacement. We already had the example of opening the windows. If you open your windows a grower, you're going to be bringing cold air in, which needs to be heated. So that's related to a few things. It first of all depends on how concentrated your source is. So air, outdoor air, has a very low concentration. It's 0.04%, continuously increasing, unfortunately, but still very low. But the higher your concentration, the lower the volume you need to heat to introduce CO2 into the greenhouse. It also, of course, depends on the energy balance of the greenhouse. So if it's August and it's a hot sunny day, you may have your windows open anyway, and then it doesn't matter. But in November, that's probably the last thing you want to be doing. So this aspect of energy demand we call weather-dependent energy demand. The second aspect is a component of energy that is required to generate or to supply the CO2. So think about a DAC machine or pumps or steps in concentration or purification. These steps have to happen no matter what the weather is outside. So energy demand. So we have weather-dependent energy demand and fixed energy demand. How do these three sources compare when we look at these two types of energy demand? Well, we can sort of draw two axes, if you like, to compare them. The first one is concentration, because of course, the higher the concentration, the lower the weather-dependent energy demand. And the other axis is the fixed energy demand, so for the DAC machine or for concentrating and so on. And our ideal CO2 source would be somewhere here. It would have a very high concentration, so you don't need to displace a lot of air, and yet it would have a low fixed energy demand. That would be the ideal. So where do these options compare? Well, outdoor air has a low concentration, but it also has a low fixed energy demand. All you need to do is open the windows. Biogenic CO2 has a higher concentration, but it has a higher fixed energy demand, depending, of course, on the context and proximity to the system and so on. But it's definitely higher than just opening the windows. And DAC is even higher because direct air capture, those machines require quite a lot of energy, depending on the machine. And typically they'll get concentrations around 50% by volume. But of course, that very much depends on the design of the system, which is by no means fixed. But this is kind of how they compare. And so you can see a trade-off between low concentration sources that don't require a lot of energy in the first place, but do ultimately require energy if you have to heat that air, and high concentration sources which require a lot of energy up front. So that brings us then to how important is it to have a high concentration? You know, after all, in a greenhouse, the highest concentration you reasonably want is about 800 ppm, 0.08%. So what's the point of bringing 50% concentrated CO2 into the greenhouse? Well, if you run the numbers, or if you sort of plug all sorts of different equations into each other, and for those who are interested in that, you can find my paper at the end of this presentation. But basically what you find out is that weather-dependent energy demand is inversely proportional to the difference between CO2 concentration of your source and the CO2 concentration you want indoors. So we can plot that. We can plot this factor against different CO2 source concentrations on the horizontal axis, and I'll put the percentages here as well. And what you see is if you want 400 ppm in your greenhouse, then this is what your weather-dependent energy demand will look like. So it's incredibly, it goes up incredibly quickly if you have a low concentration source. And it's also very sensitive to the indoor concentration you have, because at 600 it looks like this, 800 ppm like this, and 1000 ppm like this. So if your source has a concentration that's very low, it's incredibly sensitive to how much you want indoors. But the more important thing we see here is not the difference between indoor concentrations, but what happens when you increase the concentration of your CO2 source. Because basically, after 10,000 ppm or 1% volume, the benefit becomes marginal. So yeah, the question is whether it's worth having sources of CO2 that are more concentrated than this. That's something we'll find out more about later, but from this, it doesn't seem to be the case. Then, if we just compare three sources, what does that look like over an entire year? So if we take the fixed energy demand and the weather-dependent energy demand, what does that look like over an entire year? And we'll just have to make some assumptions, of course. So here we're assuming that our biogenic source is 1% volume. It's quite low, but it's still 10,000 ppm. And we're assuming that our direct air capture machine uses 6 kilowatt hours of energy per kilogram of CO2 and produces something with 50% CO2 by volume. So these are just our assumptions. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a heat map, because of course it depends on the weather throughout the year how much energy CO2 costs. So let's assume we want to achieve 400 ppm inside, which is quite a reasonable number. In summer, it often goes to lower than that. How would that look for ambient ventilation, for CO2 from outdoors? Well, this is what it would look like. So it's a heat map because on one axis, we have solar radiation from 0 to 1,000 watts per square meter. And on the other, we have the outdoor temperature from -5 to 35 degrees Celsius. And this thing you see in the middle are the months of the year from January all the way up to June, July, where we have a lot of sun and high temperatures. And then it, quite depressingly, goes down to December, where there's far less solar radiation and lower temperatures. So this is kind of an average weather profile of the Netherlands. And so what you see here is that if you want to bring 1 kilogram of CO2 into the greenhouse just by opening the windows and ventilating, that basically doesn't cost you any energy as long as you do it between April and mid-September. But as soon as you want CO2 in the greenhouse any other time of the year, it costs you an incredible amount of energy just because you're displacing so much air which has to be heated. So in this case, over 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram of CO2. You might be wondering, by the way, why this part of the heat map is white. That's because the weather is so hot that the greenhouse would have its windows open anyway. Now, how does that look for biogenic CO2? So now we're going from 425 ppm to 10,000 ppm, just 1%. Well, this is what it looks like. So you see that on a really dark, cloudy day where it's cold outside, yes, it still costs a lot of energy. But for the rest of the year, simply because of that higher concentration, the energy demand of biogenic CO2 at 1% volume is effectively negligible. Now let's look at DAC, because DAC has a higher concentration, 50%, but it starts with a bit of a disadvantage because it needs 6 kilowatt hours to produce a kilogram of CO2. And here's what it looks like. So it doesn't perform as well as biogenic CO2 because it always needs energy to concentrate CO2 out of the air, but it's still a lot better than opening the window. So if you're a grower and you don't have a biogenic source, you're better off using a direct air capture machine than opening your windows in winter if you want CO2. So that's the idea. How does it look for 800 ppm? Well, of course, it's impossible to bring indoor concentrations to 800 ppm since outside we've only got 425 ppm. But this is what it looks like for biogenic CO2 and for DAC. And I'll just do a quick back and forth between the slides. It changes slightly, but it's not really that sensitive to what concentration you want indoors. So these diagrams roughly apply to any concentration, unless you're here at the bottom where it's cold and there's not a lot of sun. Now, how does that apply over an entire growing season? Because here we've looked at how much energy it costs to bring CO2 into the greenhouse, but then the next question is, what yield does that lead to? And is it worth spending that energy? Or are we going to be spending more energy than it would cost just to build a bigger greenhouse? So really, we're comparing these two things. Is it better to have high yield by adding extra energy or using extra energy to bring CO2 into the greenhouse? Or is it better just to have a big greenhouse and sort of extensify things? So that is the question. To do that, we ran some simulations, some year-long simulations with a few assumptions. The first assumption is that without CO2, a tomato costs 6.5 kilowatt hours of energy per kilogram. So that's the number that we have to beat. And the next thing we assumed was a strategy. So this wasn't a CO2 optimization study, but to run a simulation, you have to assume some sort of strategy. Growers tend to optimize the economic outcome, of course. But in this case, we said only dose CO2 if the energy intensity remains less than 6.5. So if you're spending 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, but you're only getting 0.01 kilograms of yield in return, then it's not worth it. But if you're spending 1 kilowatt hour of energy and getting 1 kilogram of yield, additional yield in return, then you're getting more yield and you're lowering your energy intensity of your produce. So that's the question. Is it better to use this CO2 or build a bigger greenhouse? And here are the results. I'll go through them very quickly. Let's start with outdoor air. Outdoor air had a yield of only 56 kilograms per square meter. And compared to no CO2, that's only an increase of 0.3 kilograms per square meter. So basically what we're saying here is if you want to keep energy intensity of produce the same, outdoor air can barely be used. It's not worth it. And in fact, if you look at the energy intensity of that yield, it actually went up to 7 kilowatt hours from 6.5. Then with biogenic CO2, we do see quite a yield increase. It goes up by 10 kilograms and energy intensity goes down. It goes down to 6 kilowatt hours per kilogram of yield. So what we see here is that in this strategy, using biogenic CO2, it's possible to get a higher yield and yet for that yield to cost us less energy per kilogram. And lastly, for direct air capture, here you see an increase of 7 kilograms per square meter, a lot higher than the outdoor ventilation case, but still a bit lower than biogenic CO2. So how did it do in terms of energy intensity? Well, there it goes up to 9 kilowatt hours per kilogram of yield. Now, there's a reason why it's higher, even though the strategy was defined not to do that. I won't go into detail. If anyone has questions, they can ask me one-on-one or read the paper. But yeah, it's higher than the baseline case. But can this be improved? Well, to do that, we did a parametric analysis because here in these cases, we assumed certain concentrations and fixed energy demands. But what happens if you run that across all the different possible combinations, subject to saying we want the maximum yield without increasing energy intensity? Well, what you get is something that looks like this. So what we see here is on the vertical axis, we see the source CO2 concentration from 425 ppm all the way up to 1 million ppm or pure CO2. And on the horizontal axis, we see the fixed energy demand of the CO2 source. And then I've put our ambient outdoor ventilation case, our biogenic case, and our direct air capture case. I've put all three here. And what do we see? Well, the color corresponds to yield, of course. And what we see here is the same as what we saw before. The majority of the benefit is up to 1% volume. And once your CO2 has a higher concentration than 1%, it doesn't really lead to an increase in yield. So one of the takeaways from this is if you're a manufacturer of direct air capture machines, it's better to, if you can all see my cursor, it's better to try and lower the fixed energy demand of your system than to increase the concentration, because there's no point. You know, a DAC machine that produces 1% concentration rather than 50% would already be a lot better if that meant that it could lower its fixed energy demand. So prioritize fixed energy demand as long as you're above 1% in concentration. So that brings me to the end. In conclusion, non-fossil CO2 can increase yields And it's also possible to decrease the energy intensity of produce while doing so. Now, DAC and biogenic CO2 are often more energy efficient than ambient ventilation. So if you're a grower, it's better to use a DAC machine or biogenic CO2 than to open the windows, especially in winter. And that can be a way to save energy while keeping CO2 concentrations high. And I've emphasized it a few times, but I want to emphasize again, 1% volume seems to be enough for greenhouse horticulture, unless you're working on liquefaction or storage. That's another story, of course. But purely from the greenhouse's perspective, 1% volume is enough. So I'd recommend that get prioritized. That brings me to the end of my presentation. So yeah, curious to hear any questions. And if you want more information, there are also some things I left out and didn't mention, particularly around energy and CO2 efficiency. That's this graph here. Then you can find it in my paper, and otherwise feel free to contact me. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Really interesting stuff. Really interesting to see those graphs of, like where it just stops making any difference whatsoever. It's a good way to set the tone against people who sort of go, more of everything.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, a couple of questions, if I may. I mean,
yeah.
The first is there a sort of possible circular economy implementation here where you could be getting CO2 from as an output of another process, right? Would that be something that's worth considering as well, given what you're talking about here?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what's really nice about these conclusions, these results, is that I see a unique, if we think about it as an ecosystem, the greenhouse kind of has a unique niche within that ecosystem, because in the future, CO2 will be more scarce, and there are industries that will gladly pay more for high quality CO2, but we don't need that. We just need 1%. So let's prioritize using CO2 streams that have a low concentration, because yeah, we're in a unique place to use that. So I think that's where it could be implemented, of course, subject to what the local context is and what you have available. But I'd say absolutely make use of that.
Okay, and I guess the other question I wanted to ask is, and this is one that often comes up, when you measure the sort of carbon intensity of these things, it sort of naturally works from a baseline figure where you've said energy has this given carbon intensity to it, right?
Yes.
So what's the impact if you then move towards lower carbon intensity energy sources?
Yeah, so there are two things. The first thing is greenhouses will become more energy efficient in the future. I mean, if you look at an electric greenhouse using heat pumps, it already uses roughly half the energy as the case I ran the numbers on. So in the paper, we also ran the numbers on a semi-closed greenhouse with heat pumps. And yeah, it has a higher efficiency, but energy efficiency, but also more of the CO2 stays in the greenhouse. So there are two factors that kind of weigh up against each other. In that case, yeah, you see that biogenic CO2 still has a big role to play, but direct air capture less. So yeah, I think that really needs to be a priority, lowering the energy consumption of direct air capture. The other thing, of course, is the carbon intensity of the electricity you're using. So if you look at a direct air capture machine, and I'm not trying to single them out, but it's just a very easy one because it's a machine that you can sort of consider hypothetically, 6 kilowatt hours per kilogram of CO2. If you just multiply that by the energy or the carbon intensity of the Dutch grid, you're basically emitting more CO2 from the electricity production than you're bringing into the greenhouse. So that's really important to keep in mind. Now, of course, in summer, that'll be very different, and that's when CO2 demand is the highest. And in that case, it would be more sustainable to use direct air capture. But I think we definitely need to take that into account. And in the paper, yeah, I do a few quick calculations, and it really makes a difference.
Yeah. Okay, well, definitely recommending to everyone to be reading that paper. I certainly will be. Yeah, because this is something that's very much of interest to me, for sure. Alex, thank you so much. That does bring us to the close of day one. It's been an amazing day, actually. I think if I were to summarize today, my experience of it at least has been people really talking in much more specific terms than in previous years that I've done this. So whether it's this kind of presentation, really looking at the data, or UV at the beginning of the day, or panels, or everyone that, LED lighting solutions, everyone's been talking very honestly about where the trade-offs are, what the advantages and disadvantages of any given approach are. And I think that's hopefully a very positive thing, because it sort of shows a maturity in the industry, and a sense that we're willing to have these conversations and be honest about what does and doesn't work, right? And that's got to be a good thing. So yeah, thank you to all of the speakers across today, including of course Alex. Day 2 is coming. It's on the 22nd of May, with the sessions starting at 8:30 in the morning. Good God. Actually have bed fairly early for that one, but it's all good. This platform will remain open, so you can come and drop in. I believe you can even watch back over the presentations, but certainly you can meet the other attendees and the networking functions and do all of that cool stuff. So do pop into the platform in between the sessions. Yeah, day 1 session recording, sorry, it does say that here in my little notes, will be available by the 11th of May on the platform, so you will be able to come back in here and get those as well. So yes, do hang around the platform, talk to each other, network. That's what these events are all about. That's what they're for. But that does bring us to the close of day 1. So a final thank you to all of our speakers, to Alex and to Jonathan, wherever he may be, for bringing this all together. And that brings us to a close. Thank you very much to you, the audience, for being here. And we'll see you on the 22nd, if not before. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Mark. You too.